in the green density where jungle breathed with ancient rhythm, where monsoon rains fell like curtains between worlds, a war unfolded that would haunt two nations and reshape how empires measured their power. The Vietnamese highlands rose in layers of mist, their peaks hidden in clouds that seemed permanent, their valleys carved by rivers that swelled during the rains and became torrents that could sweep away bridges and roads, and the certainty that technology could master terrain. This was not the kind of landscape where American military doctrine developed for European plains and desert warfare could be easily applied. This was country that swallowed armies, that turned superiority in firepower and mobility into disadvantages when the enemy refused to present targets, when the population could not be reliably distinguished from the insurgents, when victory itself became indefinable. The roots of American involvement stretched back through layers of history that most Americans did not know or understand. For nearly a century, Vietnam had been part of French Indochina, a colonial possession, where rubber plantations and rice paddies produced wealth that flowed to Paris, while Vietnamese laborers worked under conditions that ranged from exploitative to brutal. The French brought Catholicism and baguettes, built cities like Hanoi and Saigon that mixed European architecture with Asian sensibility, created Vietnamese elite educated in French schools, who would later lead both the independence movement and the American-backed government. But they also brought the conviction that Vietnamese were inferior, required French guidance, could not govern themselves, the paternalism that would later be echoed in American certainty that South Vietnam needed protection from communist aggression. Ho Chi Minh was not born a communist, was born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890, son of a Confucian scholar who resisted French rule and passed that resistance to his son. The young Ho traveled the world as a ship's cook, lived in Paris where he encountered Marxist intellectuals, petitioned Woodrow Wilson at Versailles to support Vietnamese independence under the principle of self-determination that Wilson proclaimed, but did not extend to colonized peoples. When the petition was ignored, when Wilson proved that self-determination applied only to European peoples, Ho turned to communism not primarily from ideological conviction, but because the communists were the only major power supporting colonial independence movements. He studied in Moscow, organized Vietnamese exiles in southern China, returned to Vietnam in 1940, won to lead resistance against Japanese occupation, proclaimed Vietnamese independence in September 1945, using language borrowed from the American Declaration of Independence, believing naively that America would support Vietnamese freedom as it had supported its own. But America in 1945 was already sliding into Cold War certainty, saw the world dividing between communist and free, saw Ho's communism as threat rather than understanding his nationalism, chose to support French efforts to re-establish colonial control because France was a NATO ally whose cooperation was needed in Europe. The decision was pragmatic from American perspective, prioritized European stability over Asian independence, but it meant that America placed itself on the wrong side of history, aligned with colonialism against nationalism, created the conditions that would eventually require American soldiers to fight the war that French soldiers lost. Dien Bien Phu was the place where French Indochina died. In the valley surrounded by hills in northwest Vietnam, the French established a fortified position intended to lure Viet Minh forces into open battle where French firepower would destroy them. But General Vo Nguyen Giap turned the strategy against them, surrounded the French position with artillery, laboriously hauled up the surrounding hills, bombarded the base until supply planes could no longer land, ground down the garrison in siege that lasted 57 days, and ended in humiliating defeat that forced France to negotiate withdrawal. The Geneva Conference of 1954 temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, called for elections in 1956 to reunify the country, created breathing space that was supposed to lead to political settlement. But the elections never happened. The Eisenhower administration, fearing that Ho Chi Minh would win any fair election, his popularity was undeniable even among many in the South, supported Ngo Dinh Diem's refusal to hold the promised vote. Diem was Catholic in largely Buddhist country, was autocrat who alienated broad sectors of Vietnamese society, was corrupt and increasingly repressive, but he was anti-communist, and that was what mattered to American policymakers, convinced that dominoes would fall, that losing Vietnam would mean losing Southeast Asia, that credibility required drawing lines and defending them regardless of local realities. The 17th parallel that was supposed to be temporary administrative line became permanent wound. Families separated by the partition thought they would soon reunite, wrote letters across the divide, waited years, and then decades, and sometimes died waiting. The North built socialist society with land reform that was brutal. Thousands of landlords were executed. Collectivization was forced, but also created literacy and basic health care. The South under Diem became increasingly authoritarian. His brother's secret police arrested dissidents. Buddhist monks set themselves on fire in protest of religious persecution. The strategic Hamlet program forcibly relocated peasants. The legitimacy that any government requires slowly eroded. By early 1960s, the Viet Cong Southern Communists, supplied and directed by Hanoi, controlled large portions of the South Vietnamese countryside, moved freely at night, collected taxes and recruited soldiers, demonstrated that Diem's government existed effectively only in cities and fortified areas. The American advisors sent to train South Vietnamese forces found soldiers reluctant to fight, officers more interested in avoiding casualties than engaging enemy, corruption that undermined every program, language and cultural barriers that prevented real understanding. The advisors requested more advisors, then requested combat support troops, then requested ground forces. Each escalation justified as necessary to prevent the previous commitment from being wasted. Each step deeper into war that no one consciously decided to fight. But that became inevitable through accumulation of small decisions that individually seemed reasonable but collectively created catastrophe. The monsoon season ran from May to October, brought rains that turned dirt roads into impassable mud, grounded helicopters, filled foxholes with water, made misery constant companion of soldiers who learned that dry socks were luxury, that athlete's foot and jungle rot could be as debilitating as enemy fire, that the rain that was supposed to be temporary could last for days, that watching for enemy while also watching for leeches and snakes and mosquitoes carrying malaria created exhaustion beyond the physical. The Vietnamese had lived with monsoons for millennia, knew how to move in rain, used it as cover, understood it as element of their landscape rather than as obstacle. The Americans brought rain gear and learned slowly that fighting in monsoon was different from any warfare their training had prepared them for. That the jungle and the rain and the heat created environment as hostile as any enemy. That victory measured in body counts and territory taken meant nothing when the enemy could always return after you moved on. That the war would become matter of endurance rather than decisive battle, of wearing down the enemy's will rather than destroying his forces. The ghosts that the monsoon carried were not supernatural, were the ghosts of French soldiers who had died in the same jungles, who had learned the same lessons about limits of conventional warfare against guerrillas, whose defeat should have warned Americans but did not. Were the ghosts of Vietnamese who died in wars that stretched back centuries against Chinese, against Mongols, against French, against Japanese, each invader eventually defeated by combination of terrain and determination, by refusal to accept permanent foreign domination regardless of cost. Were the ghosts of certainty, of the conviction that American power could accomplish what French power could not, that technology would overcome human factors, that winning hearts and minds was compatible with bombing villages and burning forests, that the war could be won if only the right strategy was implemented, if only more resources were committed, if only the American people remained patient. As evening settles over the Vietnamese highlands, as the mist rises from valleys where once armies moved, the ghosts remain. The land has healed on the surface, the bomb craters have filled with water or vegetation. The defoliated forests have partially regrown. The villages have been rebuilt. But memory persists in the land as in the people. The knowledge that the monsoon that brought rain also brought war, that the green density that looks peaceful from distance concealed suffering beyond measure, that the rhythm of seasons was interrupted by rhythm of war that respected no planting or harvest, that made survival itself the primary goal, that displaced millions and killed millions more, and changed both nations in ways that 50 years have not fully processed. The monsoon still comes, still falls in curtains between earth and sky, still transforms the landscape, but now it carries only rain, only the water that makes life possible, only the seasonal rhythm that continues regardless of human conflict. The ghosts have faded or have been absorbed into the land, have become part of the story that Vietnam tells itself about endurance and survival, about defeating the greatest military power in the world through determination that would not break, through accepting casualties that would have broken any other nation, through understanding that the invaders had clocks while the Vietnamese had time, that eventually the foreigners would go home and Vietnam would remain, would rebuild, would remember, but would also try to move forward into future, that the war almost destroyed but could not prevent. In the warm waters of the Tonkin Gulf, where the South China Sea meets the coast of North Vietnam, where international shipping lanes carry vessels between ports that have traded for millennia, where fishermen cast nets as their ancestors did, an incident occurred in August 1964 that would transform limited American involvement into full-scale war. Or perhaps the incident did not occur. Or perhaps it occurred but not as reported. The uncertainty itself became part of the story, became symbol of how truth dissolves in the gulf between event and report, between what happened and what is politically useful to claim happened, between the fog of war and the deliberate obscuring of inconvenient facts. The first incident is not disputed. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, a destroyer conducting electronic surveillance in the Tonkin Gulf, was approached by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The boats attacked, fired torpedoes that missed, were driven off by Maddox's guns and by aircraft from a nearby carrier. One torpedo boat was damaged. No Americans were killed. The incident could have been treated as minor skirmish. But President Lyndon Johnson faced election in 3 months, faced opponent Barry Goldwater, who advocated more aggressive approach to communism, faced accusation that Democrats were soft on national security. The incident provided opportunity to appear tough while avoiding the full-scale escalation that Goldwater advocated. The second incident is where truth begins dissolving. 2 nights later, on August 4, the Maddox and USS Turner Joy reported they were under attack again. The night was stormy. Visibility was poor. The sea was rough. Radar operators reported contacts that suggested torpedo boats. Sonar operators reported torpedo sounds. Gunners fired at targets they could not see. The two destroyers maneuvered violently for several hours, expended ammunition against enemy they believed was present. But even as the engagement was happening, doubts emerged. The Maddox's captain reported that many contacts might have been weather effects, that sonar might have been hearing the destroyer's own propellers echoing off its wake, that no visual confirmation of enemy boats existed, that no physical evidence debris, bodies, oil slicks supported the attack narrative. The message advising caution reached Washington after the attack report had already created momentum. President Johnson had gone on television to announce that American vessels had been attacked, had ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese torpedo boat bases and oil storage facilities, had portrayed the incident as unprovoked aggression requiring firm response. The narrative was already established. The retaliatory strikes were already being executed. Pulling back would have appeared weak, would have handed political advantage to Goldwater, would have raised questions about competence and decisiveness. So the doubts were suppressed. The second attack was treated as confirmed. The momentum carried forward. 3 days later, Johnson submitted to Congress the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, requesting authority to take all necessary measures to defend American forces and assist Southeast Asian allies. The language was broad, was deliberately vague, granted presidential war powers without declaring war, created legal foundation for escalation that would follow. The debate in Congress was brief. Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon and Senator Ernest Gruening of Alaska voted against, warned that the resolution was blank check for war, argued that the second attack was not proven, that granting such sweeping authority based on murky incident was dangerous. But the warnings were ignored. The vote was 882 in Senate, 4160 in House. The consensus was overwhelming, reflected Cold War certainty that American credibility required firm response to communist aggression, that presidential authority in national security matters should not be second-guessed, that the facts as presented could be trusted. The facts as presented could not be trusted. This became clear over subsequent years as classified documents were declassified, as historians gained access to records, as National Security Agency analysts examined the incident and concluded that the second attack almost certainly did not happen, that the evidence had been selectively presented, that intercepts of North Vietnamese communications had been misinterpreted or mistranslated to support the attack narrative, that Johnson and his advisors knew within days that the second attack was questionable, but proceeded anyway because the resolution had already been passed. The strikes had already been conducted. Retreating would have been more costly politically than advancing on uncertain foundation. The moral weight of the deception is staggering. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution became the legal basis for American escalation for bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands, for troop deployments that eventually reached 540,000, for a war that would kill 58,000 Americans and perhaps 3 million Vietnamese. If the second attack did not happen, if the resolution was based on incident that was at best uncertain and at worst fabricated, then the war's legal foundation was hollow. The subsequent casualties were based on lie or mistake. The government had misled not just Congress, but the American people about the reasons for war. The parallels to later wars became impossible to ignore. The claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the certainty that proved unfounded, the intelligence that was shaped to support predetermined policy rather than policy being shaped by intelligence, these echoed the Tonkin Gulf pattern. The lesson should have been learned that governments under pressure to act will interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support action, that the fog of war obscures not just tactical situation but strategic truth, that skepticism about official narratives is not disloyalty, but necessary safeguard against catastrophic errors. That democracies must demand evidence before granting war powers, because the decision to go to war is irreversible, and its consequences are measured in lives that cannot be restored and trust that once broken cannot be fully repaired. But the lesson seems to require constant relearning. Each generation seems to forget that governments lie about wars, that intelligence is uncertain and subject to manipulation, that the urgency that officials invoke to forestall debate is often the very reason that debate is most necessary. The Tonkin Gulf should have created permanent skepticism, should have made Congress and public demand rigorous verification before supporting military action, should have established principle that benefit of doubt goes to peace rather than to war. Instead, each new crisis seems to erase institutional memory. Each new threat seems to justify trusting official assurances despite past deceptions. Each new war begins with confidence that this time the intelligence is solid, the strategy is sound, the objectives are achievable. We close standing on the shoreline where the Tonkin Gulf meets the Vietnamese coast, watching the water that looks peaceful now, that reveals no trace of the incidents real or imagined that occurred here 6 decades ago. The water holds no memory, keeps no record, offers no evidence of what happened or did not happen in the darkness of August 4, 1964. The truth dissolved here, in these waters, in the gap between event and report, in the political necessity that overrode factual uncertainty, in the resolution that granted authority based on incident that may not have occurred, in the credibility gap that would eventually undermine American society's trust in its government, and in the justifications offered for the war that would consume the next decade. The Gulf is both geographic and metaphoric, the space between truth and claim, between what leaders know and what they tell, between the clarity that distance provides and the confusion that immediacy creates. The Tonkin Gulf reminds us that wars do not always begin with Pearl Harbor clarity, with attack that cannot be denied or disputed. Sometimes wars begin in ambiguity that is resolved not through investigation, but through political need. That is clarified not by facts, but by consequences. That is understood only decades later when the classified documents are finally released. And the lies can no longer matter because the war is long over, and the dead are long buried. And the lesson once again must be relearned by a new generation facing a new crisis with old patterns. Across the Vietnamese countryside where bamboo groves whispered with wind, where villages had stood for centuries in patterns ordained by geomancy and tradition, where families had tended rice paddies for generations and ancestral graves marked the land as belonging not to individuals but to lineages extending back through time. American strategy sought to deny the Viet Cong their primary resource, the people themselves. If the guerrillas swam among the people like fish in water, the logic went, then drain the water. Concentrate the population in fortified hamlets under government control. Create free-fare zones where anything that moves becomes legitimate target. Transform the countryside into battlefield where the distinction between combatant and civilian dissolves because everyone in the free-fire zone is presumed enemy. Because survival requires assuming threat. Because hesitation kills. The Strategic Hamlet program began in 1962 under the Diem government, advised and funded by Americans who believed that separating the population from the insurgents would starve the Viet Cong of supplies and recruits and intelligence. The program was modeled on British counterinsurgency success in Malaya. But Vietnam was not Malaya. The Malayan insurgents were ethnically Chinese in majority Malay country, were easily distinguished and isolated. The Vietnamese insurgents were ethnically identical to the population, often were related to the population. Sometimes were the population farmers by day and guerrillas by night, or farmers who provided rice and shelter to guerrillas, or families with members on both sides, or simply people trying to survive between forces that both demanded loyalty and punished its absence. The strategic hamlets were built quickly, often in locations chosen for military convenience rather than for agricultural viability. Families were forced to leave ancestral villages, to abandon graves that connected them to ancestors and land, to relocate to hastily constructed settlements surrounded by barbed wire and moats, to live under curfew and surveillance, to accept that their movement was restricted, that their rice production would be monitored, that their children would attend schools teaching government propaganda. The program promised security and services, schools and medical clinics and clean water, but the promises often went unfulfilled. The hamlets were prisons as much as protection, were alienating rather than winning hearts and minds, created resentment that the Viet Cong exploited by portraying the government as puppet of foreigners who did not respect Vietnamese traditions or autonomy. By 1963, the program was failing. Many hamlets existed only on paper. Officials reported construction that had not occurred, received funds that disappeared into corruption. The hamlets that were built were often abandoned at night when Viet Cong approached. The guards melted away or joined the insurgents. The population cooperated with whoever had guns at the moment. The program was quietly ended after Diem's assassination in November 1963. But the logic behind it, that population control was key to counterinsurgency, persisted and evolved into more extreme forms as frustration mounted. As the promised quick victory receded, as the body counts rose but the enemy did not seem to weaken, as the question shifted from how to win hearts and minds to how to simply deny the enemy access to the population, regardless of the population's wishes. The Free Fire zones were the ultimate expression of this logic. Large areas of countryside were declared hostile, their inhabitants given warning to relocate or be considered enemy combatants, their villages subjected to bombardment and destruction. Anything that moved in the zones was legitimate target. Water buffalo became Viet Cong. Farmers became suspected insurgents. Children became potential threats. The designation of Free Fire zones was supposed to follow careful intelligence assessment and to provide adequate warning to civilians. But in practice, the designations were often arbitrary, the warnings inadequate or non-existent, the distinction between zones and non-zones unclear to peasants who had never seen maps, who did not understand military terminology, who sometimes learned their village was in a free fire zone only when bombs began falling. The village of My Lai was not in a designated free fire zone, but it might as well have been. On the morning of March 16, 1968, soldiers of Charlie Company, led by Lieutenant William Calley, entered the hamlet as part of search and rescue mission. They had been told that Viet Cong battalion was using the village as base, that the inhabitants were either Viet Cong or sympathizers, that resistance should be expected. They found instead women preparing breakfast, children playing, elderly sitting in doorways. They found no weapons, encountered no hostile fire, met no resistance, and they killed them anyway. The massacre lasted 4 hours. The soldiers herded villagers into groups and shot them, fired into huts where families hid, threw grenades into bunkers, killed methodically and without urgency, took breaks to smoke cigarettes between executions. Some soldiers refused to participate, some tried to stop it, but most obeyed orders or followed the example being set by their officers and fellow soldiers. Hugh Thompson, a helicopter pilot, landed his aircraft between soldiers and fleeing villagers, ordered his door gunner to fire on American soldiers if they continued, successfully evacuated some civilians, later reported what he had witnessed. But the massacre remained hidden for over a year, covered up by officers who filed false reports, protected by military culture that did not want to acknowledge what had happened, revealed finally by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who refused to accept official silence. The body count at My Lai was 504 civilians, mostly women and children and elderly, the men being away or already dead or identified as Viet Cong whether they were or not. The number includes infants and toddlers, includes pregnant women whose bodies were mutilated, includes elderly who could barely walk. The massacre was not unique, was the most infamous but not the only such incident, was extreme manifestation of war culture that had lost moral boundaries, that measured success in body counts without asking whose bodies were being counted, that created pressure to produce enemy dead, without providing reliable way to distinguish enemy from civilian. That meant that anyone killed could be counted as enemy killed. That created incentive to maximize casualties without concern for who the casualties were. The revelation of My Lai shocked Americans who wanted to believe their soldiers were liberators, who could not reconcile the massacre with the stated purpose of defending freedom, who found in the photographs of bodies piled in ditches evidence that something had gone fundamentally wrong not just with individual soldiers, but with the war itself. The massacre became symbol of the war's moral corruption, of how the brutalization of war transforms even ordinary young men into killers of children, of how the dehumanization of the enemy extends to the population, of how the distance between protecting villages from communism and destroying villages to save them from communism collapsed into indistinguishable rubble and bodies. Lieutenant Calley was convicted of murder in 1971, sentenced to life imprisonment, served 3.5 years under house arrest before being paroled. Many Americans believed he was scapegoat, that the officers above him who created the conditions and gave the orders should also have been held accountable, that the military system that produced My Lai was more culpable than individual soldiers who committed the killings. Others believed that Calley should have been punished more severely, that he got away with mass murder because the victims were Vietnamese, that the light sentence demonstrated that Vietnamese lives were valued less than American lives, that the war crimes committed by Americans were treated differently than war crimes committed by enemies. The villages that vanished into smoke numbered in the thousands. Some were destroyed deliberately, some accidentally, some simply ceased to exist when their inhabitants fled or were forcibly relocated, when the young men were drafted or joined the guerrillas, when the bombing and shelling made residence impossible, when the choice became leave or die. The villages that remained were often fractured communities. their populations divided between those who supported the government and those who supported the Viet Cong, their inhabitants caught between demands for loyalty from both sides, their children growing up knowing that expressing the wrong opinion to the wrong person could mean death for their families. We close standing where my lie stood, where now a memorial marks the site, where the names of the dead are inscribed, where the survivors have testified about what happened, where Vietnamese schoolchildren learn about the massacre as part of their history, where American veterans sometimes visit to seek forgiveness or simply to confront what they participated in or witnessed or learned about later, and carry as moral burden that no therapy can fully relieve. The smoke has cleared, but the absence remains. The villages that vanished took with them ways of life that stretched back centuries, took community bonds and cultural traditions, and knowledge that was never written down but was passed orally from generation to generation, took the anchoring to place that makes people not just occupants but part of the landscape, that makes land not just property but identity. The vanishing was not only physical, was also the vanishing of moral certainty, of the distinction between military and civilian targets, of the boundary between legitimate warfare and atrocity, of the claim that America was fighting for freedom when the methods destroyed the people who were supposedly being freed, when the villages had to be destroyed to be saved, when the logic of counterinsurgency led inexorably to treating entire populations as either potential enemies or acceptable casualties. When the smoke that rose from burning villages carried not just ash, but the remnants of the justifications that had made the war seem necessary, that had made Americans believe they were helping rather than destroying, that had obscured until too late the recognition that some wars cannot be won because winning requires means that are incompatible with the ends, that make the victory indistinguishable from defeat, that leave landscapes depopulated and morally devastated, and the victors haunted by what they did to secure a victory that vanished like smoke on the wind. Beneath the red earth of Ku Kai District, beneath the tangled roots of jungle trees and the rice paddies, where farmers planted and harvested with one eye on the sky watching for helicopters, beneath the American base whose soldiers walked unknowingly above an entire world hollowed out beneath their boots, the Viet Cong dug with simple tools and incredible determination. Dug through clay that was hard as concrete when dry, that became mud when wet, that collapsed and had to be redug, that required shoring with scavenged materials, that demanded patience measured in years and tunneling measured in inches per day. Dug a network so extensive that over 200 miles of tunnels eventually connected Ku Kai to Saigon, created underground city where entire battalions could hide, where hospitals and armories and command centers operated beneath the surface, where the darkness was so complete it seemed to have weight, where the air was so thin that candles would not stay lit, where the Viet Cong lived for weeks or months at a time like miners in a coal seam, emerging only at night to fight and forage and vanish again before dawn. The tunnels were not new invention, had been started during the war against the French, had been expanded and connected and deepened through the years of American involvement, had evolved from simple hiding places to complex infrastructure that included ventilation shafts disguised as termite mounds, multiple levels that could confuse pursuers, trapdoors so cunningly hidden that soldiers could stand on them without knowing they existed, booby traps that ranged from sharpened bamboo stakes to unexploded American ordnance recycled into mines, from pits filled with snakes to crossbows rigged to fire when tripwires were disturbed. The tunnels were engineering marvel created without blueprints or formal training, created through trial and error and necessity, created by people who had no alternative because fighting above ground meant facing American firepower that could call down artillery and airstrikes that could destroy entire grid squares, that could level forests and flatten villages, but could not penetrate 30 feet of earth. The American response to the tunnels evolved through frustration and improvisation. Initially, when tunnel entrances were discovered, soldiers would toss grenades into the openings and move on, not realizing the grenades exploded harmlessly in small chambers while the tunnels continued beyond. Then came gas attacks, CS riot control, agent pumped into tunnel systems, intended to force the Viet Cong to surface or suffocate. But the tunnels had blast doors and ventilation systems that could be closed, had water traps that absorbed the gas, had enough complexity that pumping gas into one entrance did not guarantee it would reach the deeper levels or the distant sections. The Americans tried demolitions, tried bulldozers, tried Rome plows massive bulldozers with sharp blades that could knock down trees and scrape away vegetation to clear the jungle and expose the tunnel entrances. But new tunnels could be dug, new entrances could be concealed, and clearing the jungle created other problems by destroying the villages and alienating the population and creating moonscapes that looked more like deliberate destruction than liberation. Finally, the Americans created the Tunnel Rats volunteers who were small enough to fit in the narrow passages, brave enough or crazy enough to crawl into darkness, where death could wait around any turn, where the only weapon was a pistol because rifles were too long to maneuver in tunnels, sometimes only 2 feet high and 2 feet wide, where the only light was a flashlight that made you visible to anyone waiting in darkness ahead, where the psychological pressure was immense because every foot forward could be your last, because the walls pressed in and the air was bad, and the certainty that you could get stuck or lost or killed by unseen enemy was constant companion. The tunnel rats were special breed, mostly young men, often smaller than average, always volunteers because no one could be ordered into the tunnels, always aware that their job had the highest casualty rate of any combat role, always traumatized by the darkness and confinement, and the knowledge that the enemy knew the tunnels intimately, while the Americans were blind explorers. The rats found evidence of extensive habitation sleeping chambers, kitchens with clay stoves whose smoke was vented through pipes that emerged far from the cooking areas, hospitals with operating tables and medicine captured from the Americans or supplied from the North, storage rooms with rice and ammunition, conference rooms where commanders planned operations, even theaters where troops watched propaganda films projected on walls. The tunnels were not just military infrastructure, but were complete society, were proof that the Viet Cong were not just guerrillas who hit and ran, but were organized force capable of sustaining operations indefinitely, were evidence that the American strategy of attrition was failing because no amount of casualties inflicted above ground could destroy the infrastructure that existed below ground, that regenerated, that persisted. The tunnels represented philosophical difference in how the two sides fought. The Americans brought to Vietnam the doctrine of overwhelming firepower, of using technological superiority to destroy the enemy's ability to fight, of mobility and air power and logistics that could supply armies anywhere, of measuring progress through body counts and territory controlled. The Viet Cong brought patience and acceptance of casualties that would have broken any Western army, brought willingness to suffer in darkness and deprivation for years, brought the conviction that the Americans would eventually leave while Vietnamese would remain. That time was on their side, that the tunnels gave them the one advantage that mattered: the ability to survive, to persist, to outlast the Americans regardless of how many bombs were dropped or how many soldiers were sent. The psychological impact of the tunnels on American soldiers was profound. The ground itself became enemy. Any step could trigger a mine. Any clearing could conceal tunnel entrance. Any victory could be temporary because the enemy could simply disappear underground and emerge later to reclaim what had been taken. The traditional measures of success, taking and holding ground, became meaningless when the enemy could exist beneath the ground, when clearing an area meant only that the Americans controlled the surface, while the Viet Cong controlled the depths, when victory required not just defeating the enemy, but also destroying the entire tunnel system, which was impossible because the tunnels could always be rebuilt, because the determination to dig was inexhaustible, because the Vietnamese were fighting for their land, while the Americans were fighting for abstractions like credibility and containment that seemed less substantial with each month that passed, with each soldier killed by enemy who appeared from nowhere and vanished into earth. The tunnels of Khu Kai are preserved now as historical site, as tourist attraction where visitors can crawl through sections that have been widened to accommodate Western bodies, where the darkness is interrupted by electric lights, where the danger is removed and the experience is sanitized. But even in preserved and widened state, the tunnels convey something of their original character: the claustrophobia, the disorientation, the realization that people lived and fought in such conditions for years, that what seems impossible was routine, that the human capacity to adapt and endure exceeds what comfort and safety can imagine. The Vietnamese guides who lead tour are sometimes former Viet Cong who fought in the tunnels, who emerged only at night, who lived with rats and scorpions and constant danger, who remember comrades who died in collapsed sections, or were killed by American tunnel rats, or simply could not endure the psychological pressure of prolonged underground existence and broke psychologically. We close standing at tunnel entrance, looking down into darkness that has swallowed light for decades, that once swallowed the certainty that American power could prevail through firepower and technology, that proved the limits of conventional military might against unconventional warfare fought on home ground by people with nothing to lose, but everything to protect. The tunnels remain as testament to Vietnamese determination, as symbol of the asymmetric warfare that would define conflicts for decades to come, as evidence that wars are won not always by those with superior weapons, but by those with superior will, with ability to accept suffering that their enemies cannot accept, with patience to outlast rather than overwhelm, with recognition that sometimes the only path to victory runs through darkness, through depths where the enemy will not follow, through earth that becomes sanctuary and weapon simultaneously, that swallows light and armies and the confident predictions of those who believe technology can overcome will, who learn too late that some opponents cannot be defeated by any means that civilized societies can accept, that victory requires either abandoning civilization or abandoning the war, that the choice defines not just military strategy but national character, that the tunnels pose question that each generation seems compelled to answer through bitter experience. What are you willing to do to win? And if you are not willing to do what is necessary, why did you start the war? The Lunar New Year of 1968 began with traditional truce, with families gathering for celebrations that transcended the war, with hope that perhaps this Tet would mark turning toward peace. The markets were full, the temples crowded with worshippers praying for prosperity and safety, the streets decorated with flowers and banners welcoming the Year of the Monkey. In Saigon and Hue and dozens of cities and towns across South Vietnam, people prepared feasts and visited graves of ancestors and exchanged gifts and money in red envelopes, observed customs that stretched back centuries, that connected them to past and to each other, that created brief respite from war that seemed to have no end. The Americans and South Vietnamese forces were on heightened alert intelligence, suggested that something might happen during Tet, but the intelligence was vague and contradictory, and the holiday seemed to enforce its own logic, its own temporary cessation of hostilities that both sides had generally observed in previous years. Then at 2:45 a.m. on January 31st, in Saigon, 15 Viet Cong sappers blew a hole in the wall surrounding the American embassy and rushed inside. The embassy was symbol of American presence, fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, concrete representation of American power and commitment. The breach was psychological blow before it was military event if the Viet Cong could strike here, in the heart of Saigon, in the most heavily defended location in the country. Then nowhere was safe. Then all the assurances of progress were lies. Then the war was not being won. The sappers held part of the embassy grounds for 6 hours, killed 5 Americans, were eventually all killed themselves, accomplished nothing strategically, but accomplished everything symbolically. The image of American military police firing from behind walls, of bodies in the embassy courtyard, of the breach itself, these told story that contradicted everything the American public had been told, that exposed the optimistic reports as propaganda, that created what would be called the credibility gap, the gulf between official statements and visible reality, the loss of trust that would poison American politics for generations. The embassy attack was only opening move. Across South Vietnam, in coordinated assault that involved 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops, cities and towns came under attack simultaneously. The coordination was unprecedented, demonstrated planning and logistics capability that American intelligence had not detected, revealed that the enemy was stronger and more organized than the optimistic body counts suggested, proved that the attrition strategy was failing because the enemy could replace losses and could launch major offensive despite years of American bombardment and search and destroy missions. The attack struck 36 of 44 provincial capitals, 5 of 6 major cities, dozens of district capitals and military bases. The wave was massive, was intended to spark general uprising, to demonstrate that the Viet Cong controlled the countryside and could seize the cities, to break the South Vietnamese government's legitimacy and American will to continue the war. The battle for Hue became the Tet Offensive's longest and bloodiest engagement. The ancient imperial capital, city of temples and tombs and the citadel that had housed Vietnamese emperors, fell to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces in the first hours of the offensive. 10,000 communist troops entered the city, seized most of it, raised the National Liberation Front flag over the citadel, began executing thousands of civilians they identified as government officials, Catholics, intellectuals, anyone associated with the Americans or South Vietnamese government. The mass graves would be discovered later, would contain thousands of bodies of people shot or buried alive, would testify to the brutality that accompanied the communist view of class warfare, that made no distinction between combatants and civilians once class enemies were identified, that treated entire categories of people as legitimate targets for elimination. The American and South Vietnamese counterattack to retake Hue lasted 26 days, involved house-to-house fighting that destroyed large portions of the city, required Marines to clear the citadel room by room, created casualties on both sides that were staggering even by Vietnam War standards. The Americans eventually prevailed, recaptured the city, killed thousands of communist troops, declared tactical victory. But the victory felt hollow because the city was devastated, because the cultural treasures were damaged or destroyed, because the civilian casualties were immense, because the achievement was measured in rubble and bodies rather than in reconstruction and reconciliation, because retaking Hue did not undo the fact that Hue had been lost, that the enemy had demonstrated capability to seize major city and hold it for weeks, that the optimistic assurances that the enemy was on the verge of collapse were exposed as delusion or deception. The Tet Offensive was, by conventional military measures, an American victory. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces took catastrophic casualties, perhaps 50,000 killed, entire Viet Cong units destroyed, the infrastructure in the South decimated. The general uprising did not occur. The South Vietnamese population did not rise to join the communists. The government did not collapse. The offensive did not achieve its stated objectives. The Americans and South Vietnamese held the cities, drove out the attackers, inflicted losses that would take years to recover from. General William Westmoreland proclaimed the offensive a failure, claimed that the enemy was defeated, requested 206,000 more troops to exploit the victory, to finally achieve the breakthrough that had been promised for years. But the request for more troops revealed the contradiction. If the enemy was defeated, why were more troops needed? If the offensive was a failure, why did it look like catastrophe on American television screens? If progress was being made, why did victory seem farther away than ever? The American public, watching the Tet Offensive on evening news, seeing the chaos and destruction, hearing the official claims that contradicted the visible evidence, concluded that they had been lied to, that the light at the end of the tunnel was illusion, that the war could not be won at acceptable cost, that continuation meant only more death for no achievable purpose. Walter Cronkite's broadcast on February 27, 1968, became turning point. Cronkite was not anti-war activist, but was trusted news anchor, the most trusted man in America, whose opinion carried weight with Middle America that opposed neither war nor peace reflexively, but wanted honesty and achievable objectives. Cronkite went to Vietnam after Tet, saw the destruction, talked to soldiers and officers and civilians, returned and stated on national television that the war was stalemate, that negotiations were the only rational way out, that continuing to fight would only increase the casualties without changing the fundamental reality that neither side could win decisively. President Johnson, watching the broadcast, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." 6 weeks later, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, acknowledged implicitly that his war policy had failed, that the consensus supporting the war had fractured irreparably. The photograph that came to define Tet showed Saigon Police Chief General Nguyen Ngoc Loan executing a Viet Cong prisoner in the street, pistol held to the prisoner's temple, the moment of death captured and broadcast around the world. The image became symbol of the war's brutality, of the moral ambiguity, of the ally whose methods were as disturbing as the enemy's, of the corruption and violence that American support sustained. The photographer Eddie Adams later said he regretted the photograph, that it unfairly characterized Lone, that the prisoner was accused of killing a police officer's family, that executions were routine on both sides, that the photograph was true but not complete truth. But the image persisted, became part of the visual narrative that shaped American perception more than any official statement. That made the war unwinnable in American living rooms, regardless of what happened on Vietnamese battlefields. We close standing in Hue, where the citadel walls still bear bullet holes, where the historic city has been partly restored, but will never fully recover what was lost in those 26 days when ancient temples became fighting positions and palaces became rubble, when the city that symbolized Vietnamese culture and continuity became battlefield that symbolized the war's destructiveness. That revealed how the conflict that began with promises to preserve freedom ended by destroying what it claimed to protect. Tet did not end the war. Fighting would continue for 7 more years, but it ended the illusion that the war could be won, ended the consensus that had supported escalation, ended the credibility of official optimism, created the conditions for eventual American withdrawal. The dawn that brought Tet brought also the beginning of the end, the moment when the war's trajectory shifted from escalation to de-escalation, from expansion to contraction, from confidence to doubt, from belief that victory was possible to recognition that the best outcome available was negotiated withdrawal that would be called peace, but would be understood as defeat dressed in diplomatic language. On a green Ohio campus in May 1970, where Kent State students protested the expansion of war into Cambodia, where spring semester was winding toward finals and summer break, where the protests that had roiled campuses nationwide for years had become almost routine, National Guard troops stood nervous with loaded rifles facing crowds that included curious onlookers alongside committed protesters. that mixed genuine outrage with youthful energy, that seemed threatening to some and peaceful to others depending on perspective and fear, and the weight of responsibility for maintaining order against chaos, whose definition kept shifting. The Cambodia incursion, announced by President Nixon on April 30th, had ignited protests that swept across American universities. Nixon had campaigned on promise to end the war, had implemented Vietnamization program to transfer combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, had begun withdrawing American troops in carefully calibrated phases, designed to maintain pressure on North Vietnam while reducing American casualties and domestic opposition. The expansion into Cambodia seemed to contradict the de-escalation, seemed to widen rather than end the war, provoked fury among students who felt betrayed, who had believed Nixon's promises, who now saw that the war would continue indefinitely, that their generation would continue to be drafted, that the killing would go on. At Kent State University, protests began immediately. Students gathered, marched, held rallies, called for strike, demanded that the university close in protest of the Cambodia invasion. On May 1st, protesters threw beer bottles at police cars in downtown Kent, breaking windows, causing enough disturbance that the mayor declared state of emergency and requested National Guard assistance. The next night, the ROTC building on campus was burned, whether by protesters or by provocateurs was never definitively established. But the burning escalated tensions, brought more National Guard troops, created atmosphere where confrontation seemed inevitable. On May 4th, despite a ban on rallies, about 2,000 students gathered on the Commons, the central green space of campus. Some came to protest, others came to watch, others simply walked through on their way to class. The National Guard ordered the crowd to disperse, fired tear gas when the order was ignored, advanced with fixed bayonets to push students away. The crowd scattered. Some threw rocks and tear gas canisters back toward the guard. The troops climbed Blanket Hill overlooking the Commons, turned at the crest of the hill, and at 12:24 p.m., 28 guardsmen fired approximately 67 rounds in 13 seconds. 4 students died. Jeffrey Miller, 20 years old, was shot through the mouth, fell in a parking lot 265 feet from the guard. The photograph of Mary Ann Vecchio kneeling beside his body, her arms raised in anguish, became one of the war's iconic images, not a photograph from Vietnam, but from Ohio, not of Vietnamese casualties, but of American students, not of enemy killed, but of citizens shot by their own National Guard. Allison Cross, 19, was shot in the chest 343 feet away, had been protesting the war, had placed a flower in the barrel of a guardsman's rifle earlier in the day, believing that peace was possible, that violence could be answered with symbols of life and growth. William Schroeder, 19 ROTC member walking to class, not a protester, shot in the back 382 feet from the guard, killed because he was in wrong place at wrong time, because the bullets did not discriminate between protesters and bystanders. Sandra Schuer, 20, also walking to class, shot 390 feet away, also not involved in the protest, also simply present when the shooting started, also dead for no reason that strategy or tactics could justify. 9 other students were wounded, some seriously, some shot from distances that exceeded 700 feet, proving that the shooting was not response to imminent threat but was panic or rage or revenge, was breakdown of discipline and judgment, was moment when young guardsmen who had been called up for what was supposed to be routine crowd control mission fired into crowd that they saw as threatening or contemptuous or simply other, that they saw as enemy even though the enemy was fellow Americans, fellow students, people whose only crime was being present when fear and anger overcame restraint. The investigation that followed produced more questions than answers. The President's Commission on Campus Unrest concluded that the shootings were unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. The Ohio National Guard insisted that guardsmen faced danger from the crowd, that rocks were being thrown, that their lives were threatened. But the distances at which students were shot contradicted claims of imminent danger. No one 700 feet away throwing rocks poses threat that justifies lethal force. No guardsman was injured seriously enough to require hospitalization. The narrative of self-defense seemed designed to justify what could not be justified, to create rationale for killings that were results of fear and poor training, and the poisonous atmosphere that the war had created, that made students into enemies, that transformed American campus into battlefield, where young Americans killed other young Americans. The Kent State shootings provoked national strike. Over 450 campuses closed or saw significant protests. 4 million students participated in demonstrations. The National Guard was called out on 21 campuses in 16 states. The violence at Kent State created fear that American society was fracturing beyond repair, that the divisions over Vietnam would lead to wider conflict, that the metaphor of civil war that both sides had been using was becoming literal reality. President Nixon's response, calling protesters bums, who were blowing up campuses, inflamed rather than calmed tensions, revealed how disconnected the administration was from the students' perspective, how the generation gap had become chasm where mutual understanding seemed impossible. The trial of the National Guardsmen resulted in acquittals. No one was held criminally responsible for the deaths. The civil suit brought by the families resulted in settlement where the state of Ohio paid $675,000 to be divided among the victims and their families, where the Guard issued statement expressing regret but not accepting wrongdoing, where justice seemed impossible because no punishment could restore the lives, or could adequately address what had happened. What it meant that American government could kill American citizens for protesting government policy. What it said about democracy when dissent was met with bullets. What it revealed about how deeply the war had divided the nation. The broader context made Kent State not aberration, but manifestation of divisions that ran through American society like fault lines waiting for earthquake. The Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968 had seen police beating protesters in streets while convention nominated Hubert Humphrey, who supported continuing the war. The Weathermen, radical faction of Students for a Democratic Society, had begun bombing campaign targeting government buildings and corporate offices, believing that violence was necessary to stop the war, that peaceful protest had failed, that the system had to be destroyed rather than reformed. The silent majority that Nixon invoked middle Americans who supported the war, or at least opposed the protesters, viewed the students as spoiled and disrespectful, as privileged youth who refused to do their duty, who undermined the troops and aided the enemy, who deserved whatever consequences their actions provoked. The draft lottery instituted in 1969 made military service matter of chance. Birthdays drawn randomly determined who would go to Vietnam and who would not, created inequality where some served and some did not, based on luck rather than merit or need. The deferments available for college students and for certain occupations meant that the burden fell disproportionately on working class and poor, on those who could not afford college or whose occupations were not deemed essential, on Black and Latino communities whose young men went to war in numbers that exceeded their proportion of population, who fought for freedoms in Vietnam that they did not fully possess at home, whose communities saw the war as racist and imperialist, who questioned why they should fight against Vietnamese peasants when their real enemy was the system that oppressed them in America. The veterans returning from Vietnam found no welcome parades, no grateful nation, no acknowledgement of their service and sacrifice. Found instead hostility from protesters who called them baby killers, found indifference from those who wanted to forget the war, found that the country had moved on while they remained trapped in memories of combat and of friends who died, found that the psychological wounds they carried had no name yet, that what would later be called PTSD was in 1970 just private suffering borne alone, was alienation from society that seemed to blame them for a war they did not start, for a policy they did not create, for following orders and serving their country in war that their country now wanted to pretend had not happened, or at least wanted to stop discussing. The tragedy of Kent State was that it made visible what had been abstract, made the war's cost visible, not in distant jungles but on American campus, made the casualties not Vietnamese but American students, made the violence not justifiable as combat necessity but inexcusable as domestic failure, made clear that the war had come home, that the divisions it created were tearing apart the social fabric, that something fundamental had broken in American society. That trust between generations and between citizens and government had been shattered, that the consensus that had made America a superpower was fracturing into competing visions that could not be reconciled through normal political processes. We close standing on the Kent State Commons where markers now indicate where the 4 students fell, where the parking lot has been preserved as memorial, where every May 4th vigil is held, where candles are lit and names are read and the questions are asked again. Why did this happen? Could it have been prevented? What did their deaths achieve? What did their deaths mean? The spring that turned red in 1970 turned also the trajectory of American attitude toward the war, made opposition mainstream rather than fringe, made continuing the war politically untenable even as fighting continued for 5 more years, made clear that the price of the war was being paid not just by soldiers in Vietnam, but by the fabric of American society itself, that the war was destroying what it claimed to protect, that freedom defended through such means was freedom diminished, that the campus where young Americans were killed by other young Americans was battlefield as surely as any rice paddy in Vietnam, was casualty of war that was fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with competing visions of America's purpose and identity, visions that remain contested, that make Kent State not just historical event, but continuing symbol of the costs of war, of the limits of protest, of the fragility of democracy when pushed beyond its capacity to contain dissent. When force is used against citizens, when spring turns red and the blood that falls is American blood on American soil, and the questions remain unanswered 50 years later. Through Laotian jungle and Cambodian border regions, through mountain passes where mist clung to peaks like memory, through triple canopy forest so dense that ground remained in perpetual twilight, the Ho Chi Minh Trail carried supplies from north to south, endless columns of bicycles and trucks and porters, moving under cover of darkness, rebuilding every night what American bombs destroyed during the day, creating supply line that could not be severed despite years of effort and tonnage of explosives that exceeded all bombs dropped in World War II, despite technology and determination, and the conviction that interdiction would strangle the insurgency, that cutting the trail would win the war. The trail was not single path but network, multiple routes that shifted with seasons and with American pressure, that branched and reconnected, that included roads for trucks during dry season and footpaths for porters during monsoons when roads became impassable, that stretched over 10,000 miles if all branches were counted, that passed through terrain so difficult that simply traversing it was achievement, that required months to complete, that killed through disease and exhaustion and bombing as surely as through combat, that demanded sacrifice measured in thousands of lives of people whose names are forgotten, but whose contribution made North Vietnamese victory possible. The trail began as simple footpath in 1959, widened and improved as war escalated, eventually became sophisticated logistics network with way stations and hospitals and anti-aircraft batteries, with engineering units that maintained roads and rebuilt bridges, with communication stations that coordinated traffic, with underground fuel storage and ammunition dumps camouflaged so well that American reconnaissance often missed them even when flying directly overhead. The North Vietnamese called it the Truong Son Strategic Supply Route, named for the mountain range through which it passed, invested enormous resources in maintaining it, assigned thousands of youth volunteers to trail duty, created youth shock brigades whose task was to keep supplies flowing regardless of cost. The Americans called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail and sought desperately to close it. Operation Rolling Thunder included interdiction missions that bombed suspected trail segments, that cratered roads and destroyed bridges, that attacked truck convoys spotted by reconnaissance aircraft or detected by sensors scattered along the trail. The sensors, primitive by later standards but sophisticated for their time, could detect truck engines and troop movements, radioed information to command centers that directed airstrikes, created electronic battlefield that was supposed to compensate for inability to send ground troops into Laos and Cambodia, that was supposed to make the trail too costly to use, that would force the North Vietnamese to negotiate seriously. But the trail never closed. Every night, work crews filled bomb craters. Every week new bridges appeared, sometimes proper spans, sometimes underwater bridges invisible to aerial reconnaissance, sometimes simply fords where trucks crossed rivers slowly, accepting losses to water damage and occasional drowning, accepting that some percentage of supplies would not arrive, that the losses were sustainable because enough did arrive to sustain the war in the South. Because the calculation was not whether the trail was efficient, but whether it was adequate, whether it moved enough supplies to keep the war going, whether the Americans could destroy it faster than the Vietnamese could rebuild it. The answer was always no. The Americans could crater roads faster than the Vietnamese could repair them, but roads could be repaired faster than craters could be created. The Americans could destroy trucks faster than the North Vietnamese could replace them. China and Soviet Union provided endless supplies, but destroying trucks did not destroy the cargo they carried, which was often transferred to porters who continued on foot, who could not be bombed effectively because they moved in small groups, who carried supplies on bicycles modified to bear 500 pounds, who pushed these overloaded bicycles through mountain trails, who took weeks to make journeys that trucks made in days but who eventually arrived, who could not be stopped except by bombing so intensive it would have required invading Laos and Cambodia, which Nixon eventually did briefly in 1970, but which provoked such domestic opposition. Kent State occurred in protest of Cambodia incursion, that the ground invasions could not be sustained. The people who kept the trail open were mostly young teenagers and 20-somethings, volunteers motivated by nationalism and by sense of duty, by desire to reunite their country, by belief that the Americans were invaders who had to be expelled regardless of cost. They lived in primitive conditions, shelters dug into hillsides, hammocks strung between trees, food that was often inadequate, medical care that was minimal, constant danger from bombing and from disease, from malaria and dysentery and infected wounds, from exhaustion and from despair that came from months or years in jungle with no leave, no relief, no certainty of survival. Many died, perhaps 30,000 over the course of the war, though numbers are uncertain because records were not kept carefully, because acknowledging casualties might have hurt morale, because the policy was to emphasize sacrifice and duty rather than dwelling on losses. The women on the trail were not just support staff, but were combat troops, operated anti-aircraft guns that brought down American planes, drove trucks through enemy fire, maintained roads under bombardment, fought with determination that matched the men's, demonstrated that the war was not gender-specific, that defending the homeland was responsibility shared by all, that the Americans faced not just military force but entire society mobilized for war, willing to endure casualties that no Western nation could accept, patient beyond what American political system could sustain. The women's contributions were celebrated in North Vietnamese propaganda, but were also genuine. The trail could not have functioned without them. The war could not have been won without their sacrifice. The victory that came in 1975 was as much theirs as the soldiers who entered Saigon in tanks. The American pilots who flew interdiction missions faced one of the war's most dangerous assignments. The North Vietnamese anti-aircraft defenses along the trail were formidable radar-guided AAA, surface-to-air missiles, heavy machine guns that could bring down low-flying aircraft, creating an environment where pilots had to fly low enough to identify targets but high enough to avoid ground fire, where the margin between effective attack and being shot down was narrow, where the weather often prevented flying, where the triple canopy concealed targets even from skilled observers, where the frustration of hitting targets that seemed to regenerate overnight was constant, where the question of whether the missions accomplished anything was unspoken but present, where many pilots died or were captured without clear evidence that their sacrifice achieved strategic purpose. The trail represented different philosophies of warfare: the American faith in technology and firepower against Vietnamese faith in human will and endurance, The American assumption that sufficient force could solve any problem against Vietnamese recognition, that some problems cannot be solved by force, that patience and persistence and acceptance of suffering can defeat enemy with superior weapons. That time is resource as valuable as technology. That the side that can endure longer will prevail regardless of casualty ratios. That the Americans had clocks while the Vietnamese had time. The trail's persistence became argument for North Vietnamese victory even before war ended. Demonstrated that the Americans could not win militarily because they could not destroy the trail, that the strategy of attrition was failing because the North could replace losses faster than the Americans could inflict them, that the bombing campaigns were not working because the trail remained open, that the only way to close the trail would be ground invasion of Laos and Cambodia that would expand the war beyond what American public would support. That the choice was between escalation to potentially nuclear war. Some advisors seriously suggested using tactical nuclear weapons to close the trail or negotiated withdrawal that would amount to defeat. We close standing in jungle where the trail passed, where the ruts are still visible, where the bomb craters have become ponds, where the bridges rebuilt so many times have finally been replaced by permanent structures, where the young who died maintaining the trail are remembered in monuments and in the stories their families tell, where the trail has become hiking path for tourists who walk in comfort along routes where once porters struggled with crushing loads, where the difficulty of the journey becomes clear when you try to walk even short section, where the recognition comes that what the Americans could not destroy was not just physical infrastructure, but was will and determination and acceptance of sacrifice, that no amount of bombing could break, that no technology could overcome. That made the trail into symbol of why the Americans could not win, why the war eventually had to end in American withdrawal, why the trail that was supposed to be cut became the route along which victory came, slowly, inexorably, one bicycle load at a time, one repaired road section at a time, one night's work at a time, until the cumulative effect of countless small efforts by anonymous youth volunteers created strategic outcome that all the American firepower and technology could not prevent. In Paris, hotel rooms and formal conference halls where chandeliers hung like frozen tears, where delegates met to negotiate peace while soldiers died in jungles thousands of miles away, where discussions dragged through years of deadlock over issues that seemed trivial to those not present the shape of the negotiating table, whether to call it two-sided or four-sided conference, who sat where and in what order. The wording of statements that everyone knew were propaganda rather than substantive proposals. The Vietnam peace talks became symbol of how difficult it is to end wars once begun, how pride and perception and domestic politics can matter more than pragmatic settlement, how diplomacy becomes theater performed for audiences at home rather than genuine negotiation with enemy. The Paris talks began in May 1968, continued with long interruptions and resumptions until January 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed, creating peace that lasted barely 2 years before being shattered by North Vietnamese offensive that conquered the South. The 5 years of negotiation occurred while the war intensified, while American troop levels peaked at 540,000, while Vietnamization transferred combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, while American casualties mounted to 58,000 dead, while Vietnamese casualties on both sides reached into the millions. The question that haunted the negotiations from the beginning was what later came to be asked explicitly. If the settlement eventually reached in 1973 could have been reached earlier, how many died while diplomats argued over table shapes and seating arrangements? If the outcome was foreordained that Americans would withdraw and the South would eventually fall, why did the dying continue for 5 years? What purpose did the additional casualties serve except to preserve American credibility and to allow Nixon to claim peace with honor, rather than admitting defeat? Henry Kissinger and Leduc, though conducted the secret negotiations that produced the accords, met in private sessions away from formal conference, developed relationship that was part negotiation and part mutual respect and part manipulation, where each tried to gain advantage while preserving ability to continue talking, where the mutual deception was assumed, and the question was only whether they could reach agreement that both could present as victory to their respective audiences. Kissinger was brilliant and cynical, understood that the agreement would not bring genuine peace, but would provide decent interval between American withdrawal and South Vietnam's collapse, understood that the purpose was not to save South Vietnam, but to extract America from war without appearing to abandon an ally, to preserve American credibility for future conflicts, even as present conflict was being lost. Leduc, though, was equally skilled, understood that North Vietnam held stronger position because time favored them, because American domestic opposition to the war was growing, because the American political system could not sustain prolonged war while North Vietnamese system could, because the North had only to persist while the Americans had to win, and winning was undefined or impossible depending on how it was measured. Leduc, though, could afford to wait, to reject proposals, to drag out negotiations, because every month that passed weakened American position, increased American casualties, intensified American opposition to the war. Kissinger operated under deadline imposed by American political cycle, had to achieve agreement before opposition forced unconditional withdrawal, had to produce settlement that Nixon could present as achievement rather than failure. The settlement reached in January 1973 was fundamentally flawed from the start. It called for ceasefire and withdrawal of American forces, but allowed North Vietnamese forces to remain in South Vietnam, creating military imbalance that made South's eventual defeat likely. It called for political settlement through negotiations between Saigon government and Provisional Revolutionary Government, but provided no mechanism to enforce such negotiations, no international presence sufficient to guarantee compliance, no consequences for violations beyond resumption of war that everyone knew Americans would not re-enter regardless of North Vietnamese violations. The agreement was designed to be violated, was peace that was poisoning itself even as it was signed, was diplomatic fiction that allowed Americans to leave while pretending they were leaving South Vietnam viable. The concept of peace with honor that Nixon proclaimed was contradiction if peace required American withdrawal while North Vietnamese forces remained in South, if peace made South's eventual conquest likely, if peace was recognized by all parties as temporary measure pending American departure. Then what honor existed in settlement that abandoned ally? The honor was not in the agreement but in the claim, not in the substance but in the presentation, not in achieving genuine peace, but in creating appearance of peace sufficient to allow American withdrawal, without acknowledging defeat explicitly. The Vietnamization program that supposedly prepared South Vietnamese forces to defend themselves was similarly flawed. The program transferred weapons and equipment and responsibility to South Vietnamese military that was corrupt, that had poor leadership, that had been dependent on American support for so long that sudden independence was shock rather than liberation, that had never been allowed to develop genuine autonomy, because American advisors made the key decisions, that was being asked to fight alone against enemy that was battle-hardened and determined, and supplied by China and Soviet Union, that had defeated France and was now defeating America, and would not be stopped by South Vietnamese forces, however well equipped. The Christmas bombing of 1972, Operation Linebacker II, was final American demonstration of what could have been done earlier if will had existed. For 12 days, B-52s bombed Hanoi and Haiphong with intensity that had been politically unacceptable earlier in the war, destroyed infrastructure and killed thousands, provoked international condemnation, but also broke deadlock in negotiations, brought North Vietnamese back to table willing to accept terms that Americans offered. The bombing demonstrated that military pressure could have been more effective if applied differently, but also demonstrated the political constraints that had prevented such bombing earlier. That made the war unwinnable not through military incapacity, but through political unwillingness to do what would have been required, through recognition that destroying Hanoi would have been war crime, that the costs of winning exceeded the value of victory. The moral weight of the years between 1969 and 1973 is crushing. Nixon and Kissinger knew the war was lost, knew that withdrawal was inevitable, knew that South Vietnam would likely fall after Americans left. But they continued the war for 4 more years, killed 20,000 more Americans and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese, because domestic politics required withdrawal that appeared chosen rather than forced, that preserved presidential credibility even as national credibility was being destroyed, that maintained appearance of supporting allies even as those allies were being abandoned. The calculation was purely political: how much death was acceptable to achieve political goal of not appearing to lose. How many lives could be sacrificed to maintain fiction that America had not been defeated? How much suffering was justified to preserve honor that was rhetorical rather than real? The shared Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Kissinger and Le Duc Tho in 1973 was ironic achievement. Le Duc Tho refused to accept it, stating that peace had not been achieved, that the settlement was temporary ceasefire pending American departure, that accepting the prize would be premature and dishonest. Kissinger accepted the prize while understanding the same reality, understanding that peace would not last, that the agreement was diplomatic fiction, that the prize honored not achievement but intention or appearance or simply desire to end the war that international community shared regardless of whether the ending could properly be called peace. We close in the room where the accords were signed, where photographs captured the moment when pens touched paper, when the diplomats shook hands, when the cameras flashed and the achievement was proclaimed, when the fiction was made official through ceremony and signatures, when the reality that everyone understood but no one acknowledged that this was not peace but was American surrender disguised as settlement remained unspoken, because speaking it would have made the charade impossible, would have forced acknowledgement that the war had been lost, that the deaths had been for nothing, that the strategy had failed, that the assumptions had been wrong, that the dominoes did not fall when Vietnam reunified under communist rule, that the war that was supposed to prevent communist expansion succeeded only in killing millions and dividing America, and demonstrating the limits of military power when fighting nationalist movement on its home ground. When technology cannot compensate for lack of political will, when credibility becomes obsession that prevents rational calculation of costs and benefits, when the room where peace is made becomes the room where peace is poisoned by the lies that made it possible, by the knowledge that it is not peace but merely American exit, by the understanding that history will record this as defeat regardless of what the diplomats call it, by the silence about the additional deaths that occurred while diplomats negotiated, by the question that will not be answered because the answer is too terrible. How many died for peace with honor, when withdrawal without honor would have ended the war years earlier and would have been, for all the lives it saved, the more honorable choice. On the rooftop of the American Embassy in Saigon, on April 30, 1975, as dawn broke over a city dissolving into chaos, as North Vietnamese tanks rolled through streets where American power had once seemed unshakable, as the last helicopters lifted off carrying American personnel and select Vietnamese allies, while thousands more pressed against embassy gates begging for evacuation that would not come. The photograph was taken that would define the war's end, people climbing a ladder to helicopter perched on rooftop, the desperate scramble to escape, the knowledge that capacity was limited and most would be left behind, the visible symbol of American defeat and broken promises, and the selective salvation that prioritized some lives and abandoned others. The fall of Saigon was rapid but not unexpected. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 had held tenuously for 2 years, while North Vietnamese forces rebuilt and repositioned, while South Vietnamese forces struggled without American air support and logistics that had sustained them, while American Congress reduced aid to Saigon government as domestic opinion shifted toward forgetting the war and refusing to recommit resources to conflict that was over in all but official acknowledgement. The North Vietnamese offensive began in March 1975, encountered South Vietnamese forces that collapsed faster than anyone predicted, advanced through central highlands and down the coast, met resistance that was sporadic and ineffective, demonstrated that Vietnamization had failed, that South Vietnamese government's legitimacy was so weak that even its own soldiers would not fight to preserve it. President Thieu fled on April 21st, taking with him enormous wealth accumulated through corruption, leaving behind country that was imploding, delivering resignation speech that blamed Americans for betrayal, for promising support that did not materialize, for creating dependence, and then withdrawing, for making commitments that proved hollow when tested. The speech was bitter but accurate. Americans had promised support, had encouraged South Vietnamese to fight, had assured them that abandonment would not occur, had made those assurances while knowing or suspecting that American domestic politics would not sustain long-term commitment, that the promises were contingent on political circumstances that might change, that did change. That left South Vietnam alone against enemy that had defeated France and had fought America to stand still, and would not be stopped by South Vietnamese forces that had always been dependent on American power. The American evacuation operation Frequent Wind was chaotic and selective. The official plan called for orderly departure of American personnel and Vietnamese, who had worked directly for Americans and faced retribution. But the speed of North Vietnamese advance compressed the timeline, forced improvisation, created situation where helicopters flew continuous missions from embassy rooftop and from other locations around Saigon, where Marine guards held back crowds, where the choice of who to evacuate became desperate calculation of who had worked most closely with Americans, who faced greatest danger, who could be accommodated in limited space and time remaining. The evacuees numbered about 7,000 in the final days, but thousands more who had worked for Americans, or who had fought alongside Americans, or who simply feared communist retribution, were left behind because capacity was exhausted, because helicopters could not carry everyone, because the decision to evacuate came too late, because the promises of protection proved contingent rather than absolute. The photograph that became iconic, the ladder, the helicopter, the desperate climb, was actually not from the embassy rooftop, but from a CIA building nearby. But the location mattered less than the symbolism, the visible evidence that America was leaving in haste and disorder, that the power that had seemed so formidable in 1965 was retreating in disarray in 1975, that the promises made to South Vietnamese allies were being broken in real time as helicopters lifted off and gates closed, and people who had trusted America were left to face communist government alone. For North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, April 30, 1975, was victory after 3 decades of war, was reunification of country divided by foreign powers, was expulsion of final foreign invader, was validation of sacrifices made and suffering endured, was proof that determination and patience and acceptance of casualties could defeat any enemy regardless of technological superiority, was moment when nationalist goal of unified independent Vietnam was finally achieved, was triumph that cost perhaps 2 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong lives, but that succeeded where previous generations had failed, that ended cycle of foreign domination that stretched back through American and French and Japanese and Chinese rule, that made Vietnam finally and completely Vietnamese. But the victory was incomplete. The communist government that took power implemented policies that drove millions into exile, that created boat people exodus, that forced Vietnamese who had supported South, or who simply feared communist rule, to risk everything, fleeing by sea in overcrowded vessels, dying by tens of thousands from storms and pirates and thirst, creating Vietnamese diaspora that spread across the world, that preserved memory of South Vietnam that no longer exists except in refugee communities, that carries complex relationship with homeland that is simultaneously home and foreign country, that is Vietnam but not the Vietnam they remember, that has changed beyond recognition from the country they fled. The re-education camps where South Vietnamese soldiers and officials and intellectuals were sent were prisons by another name, places where inmates underwent political indoctrination, where conditions ranged from harsh to brutal, where many died and others emerged traumatized, where the victor's revenge was exacted on the defeated, where the promise of reconciliation that had been part of communist propaganda gave way to reality of retribution, where the cost of losing the war was years of imprisonment and forced labor and political repression that made clear that reunification meant Northern victory and Southern subjection, rather than genuine national reconciliation. The American veterans watching on television experienced complex emotions that defied easy categorization. Relief that the war was finally over, that no more American soldiers would die in Vietnam, that the draft would end and the country could move on. Anguish that it ended this way, with allies abandoned and promises broken, and the visible defeat that the helicopter images captured. Anger at politicians who had sent them to fight and then withdrawn support, who had made the war unwinnable through restrictions, and then blamed the military for not winning, who had asked for sacrifice, and then dismissed that sacrifice as wasted, who had created situation where veterans were caught between hawks who blamed them for losing and doves who blamed them for fighting. Grief for friends who died in a war that America lost, that ended with communist victory and American retreat, that made the deaths seem meaningless because the outcome they were supposed to prevent had occurred anyway. The question that haunted many veterans was whether their service had meant anything, whether the war had any purpose beyond the credibility and containment that seemed abstract compared to the reality of combat and casualties, whether anything had been achieved that justified the sacrifice, whether the Vietnamese they had tried to help would be better off if Americans had never come, whether the war had been tragic mistake from the beginning, or had been noble cause poorly executed, or had been lost at home, rather than on battlefield, or had been unwinnable from the start because the enemy cared more and would fight longer, and would accept casualties that Americans could not accept because Vietnam was their country and America was just passing through. The Vietnamese refugees who escaped carried with them memory of South Vietnam, of the republic that had existed for 20 years and then vanished, of the government that Americans supported and then abandoned, of the society that had been imperfect and corrupt but had also been home, that had offered future that communist victory foreclosed, that had represented different possibility for Vietnam that was destroyed not through its own failure, but through American withdrawal, through congressional refusal to provide promised support, through domestic political pressures that made continuing the war impossible regardless of consequences for South Vietnamese, who had relied on American promises. The memory they carried was bitter betrayal and loss and exile that could not be reversed, that made them strangers in new lands while their homeland became foreign country under communist rule. We close standing before the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, That black granite wall bearing 58,318 names, that reflective surface where visitors see themselves among the names, where the design creates contemplation rather than glorification, where the absence of heroic rhetoric forces confrontation with loss itself. The wall was controversial when first proposed. Veterans wanted traditional monument celebrating their service. Critics found the black wall too mournful, but the wall has become sacred site where the fallen are remembered without requiring judgment about whether their deaths were meaningful, where families visit and veterans gather, and the grief is shared, where the names transform from casualty statistics into individuals, into sons and fathers and brothers whose lives ended in jungles most Americans could not locate on maps, whose sacrifice is honored even as the war that required their sacrifice remains controversial. The helicopter lifting off that Saigon rooftop, leaving people behind, carrying the image that would haunt American foreign policy for decades, represents the war's end, but also its legacy, the lesson that military power has limits, that commitments must be sustainable, that promises to allies must be kept or should not be made, that wars begun with confidence can end in confusion, that the costs of war are measured not just in casualties but in credibility and trust, and the moral weight of abandoned obligations. The people left behind haunt still the Vietnamese who trusted American promises, the refugees who escaped but lost homeland, the veterans who fought and whose service was dismissed or forgotten, the dead whose names are carved in stone but whose purpose remains debated. The helicopter flew away, but the questions remained, will always remain, about why the war was fought and how it was lost, and what it means, and whether the lessons have been learned or whether each generation must relearn them through bitter experience that produces new names on new walls, new helicopters leaving new people behind. New wars that end with recognition that some conflicts cannot be won, that some promises cannot be kept, that some mistakes cannot be undone except by preventing them, which requires remembering what this war taught, which requires acknowledging that the helicopter that left people behind carries warning as well as shame, carries lesson about the costs of war and the limits of power, and the importance of asking whether military force can achieve political objectives before committing forces and making promises, and discovering too late that the war cannot be won at acceptable cost, and that leaving means breaking faith with those who trusted you, means the helicopter lifting off without them, means the image that defines defeat. On the National Mall in Washington, where monuments to presidents and wars rise in white marble declaring triumph and purpose, a black granite wall angles into earth bearing 58,318 names arranged not alphabetically, but chronologically by date of death, creating memorial that provoked controversy when first proposed, but has become sacred site where Americans confront the war's human cost, without the mediation of strategy or politics or debates about whether the war was justified, where names transform from casualty statistics into individuals whose lives ended in specific places on specific dates for reasons that remain contested, but whose loss transcends controversy, whose absence is made permanent and visible and undeniable by their names carved in stone, that reflects the living who come to remember the dead. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was designed by Maya Lin, 21-year-old architecture student at Yale, whose competition entry was selected from over 1,400 submissions in 1981, whose vision was not triumphal arch or heroic statue, but contemplative space, descending pathway that brings visitors below grade as they walk along the wall, creating sense of being embraced or enclosed or drawn into the earth, creating intimacy with the names that tower above on both sides, creating experience that is personal rather than collective, that invites individual reflection rather than imposing narrative about what the war meant or what the deaths achieved, that honors the fallen without glorifying the war, that creates space for grief and remembrance without requiring consensus about whether the sacrifice was necessary or the cause was just. The controversy when Lin's design was revealed reflected divisions about the war that persisted a decade after its end. Some veterans wanted traditional memorial heroic bronze statues of soldiers in combat, flags flying, inscription proclaiming noble sacrifice, design that would declare that the veterans had served honorably even if the war had been lost, that would distinguish between the warriors and the war, that would honor the service regardless of outcome. Critics of Lin's design called it black gash of shame, said the color was wrong, black being associated with mourning and death rather than with honor and sacrifice, said the design was too abstract, too artistic, too feminine in vision, not martial enough for warriors who had fought and died, not triumphant enough for Americans who wanted to honor the fallen without acknowledging defeat. The compromise was typical American solution: keep Lin's wall, but add traditional elements to satisfy those who wanted more conventional memorial. Frederick Hart's statue of 3 servicemen, white, black, Hispanic in combat gear, was placed near the wall, providing the figurative element that some veterans wanted, creating counterpoint to Lin's abstraction. Later, the Women's Memorial was added, honoring the thousands of women, mostly nurses, who served in Vietnam, whose contributions had been overlooked, whose presence on the wall as casualties was minimal because most served in rear areas, but whose service was essential, and whose trauma from treating the wounded and dying was real even if they did not carry rifles. But the wall itself became the memorial's heart, the element that draws millions of visitors annually, that creates the powerful emotional response, that has changed how Americans memorialize wars by demonstrating that naming the dead individually is more powerful than abstract tribute, that making their sacrifice visible through their names creates connection that statistics cannot, that the act of finding a specific name and touching it or tracing it or leaving an offering beside it transforms abstract loss into personal grief, makes the war real in a way that no amount of historical analysis can achieve, forces confrontation with the reality that 58,318 is not just number but is collection of individuals whose lives ended, whose futures were taken, whose families were devastated, whose potential contributions to world will never be realized. The wall's reflective surface creates powerful effect. Visitors see themselves among the names, see the dead and the living merged in reflection, see that the war's legacy includes those who survived and remember as well as those who died and are remembered. See that separation between those who came back and those who did not is thinner than it appears. That survival creates obligation to remember, that the living carry forward the stories and sacrifices of the dead. That memory is how the dead continue to matter, how their lives retain meaning beyond the moment they were lost. The rituals that have emerged at the wall were not planned but have become tradition, the practice of taking rubbings of names, pressing paper against the stone, and using pencil to capture the name, creating portable memorial that visitors can take home, that families display, that makes connection physical and tangible. The leaving of offerings has become elaborate flowers and letters and photographs, dog tags and medals and unit patches, bottles of liquor shared one last time with fallen comrades, teddy bears for the young who died before experiencing much of life, purple hearts and combat infantry badges, and every variety of military memorabilia, mementos both sacred and personal that express grief and respect, and the continuing bond between the living and the dead. The National Park Service collects these offerings daily. The perishables are discarded. The artifacts are cataloged and stored, creating massive collection that documents how Americans remember Vietnam War dead, that preserves the personal history that supplements the official history, that shows how grief is expressed across decades as children visit fathers' names, as aging veterans visit friends' names, as high school sweethearts visit names of young men they loved who never came home, who remain forever young in memory while those who remember them age, creating gap not just of time but of experience, of the life lived versus the life lost, of the future that continued versus the future that ended. The wall has changed how Americans relate to the war. By creating non-political space for remembrance, by refusing to take position on whether the war was right or wrong, by simply naming the fallen and letting their sacrifice speak for itself. The wall has enabled healing that was not possible while the war remained fresh and the divisions remained sharp. Veterans who return to hostility have found at the wall the recognition and respect that was denied them when they came home. Families who lost sons and fathers and brothers have found at the wall the acknowledgement that their loss matters, that their loved ones are not forgotten, that the nation honors their sacrifice even if the nation remains divided about the war that required it. The wall does not resolve the moral questions about the war, does not declare whether the war was justified, or whether the deaths were meaningful, or whether the outcome makes the sacrifice worth it, does not impose narrative about heroism or tragedy or waste, simply names the dead and invites remembrance and creates space where Americans can confront the war's human cost without being required to reach consensus about what it means. The power of the wall lies precisely in this refusal to impose meaning, in its invitation to each visitor to determine for themselves what these deaths signify, what they teach, what obligation they create for the living. The debates about the war continue, whether it was winnable, whether different strategy could have succeeded, whether withdrawal was betrayal or wisdom, whether the domino theory was valid or paranoid, whether American intervention was justified or was imperialism, whether the veterans served nobly or were tools of policy that was misguided, whether the war's lessons have been learned or must be relearned by each generation. But at the wall, the debates fall away, or at least are suspended. At the wall, what matters is not policy or strategy, but people-specific individuals whose names are carved in stone, whose lives were cut short, whose absence is mourned by those who knew them, and by many who did not but who recognize that these deaths represent loss that transcends politics, that touches something fundamental about human cost of war, about the weight that the living carry when the dead are forgotten or their deaths are dismissed as statistics or their sacrifice is used to justify continued sacrifice that might be avoided if the lessons of their deaths were heeded. We close standing before the wall at twilight, watching as visitors trace names with their fingers, as offerings are left, as the fallen are remembered. The wall does not speak, the stone is silent, but the names speak of loss and service and sacrifice, speak of young lives ended in distant jungle, speak of families broken, speak of the war that divided America and Vietnam, that killed millions and changed both nations in ways that 50 years have not fully healed. The wall where names become memory stands as testament not to victory or defeat, but to cost, to human price paid when nations go to war, to the names that must be carved when policy fails, to the memory that must be preserved when the living can no longer ask the dead whether their sacrifice was worth it, can only honor that sacrifice by remembering their names, by ensuring that their deaths are not forgotten, even as the war that killed them fades from immediate memory into history, into the wall where names are carved and memory is made permanent, and the fallen are honored not for why they died but because they lived, because they were, because their names remain even when everything else about the war is contested or forgotten or deliberately suppressed. The names remain, speaking without words, testifying without judgment, remembering without imposing meaning, inviting us to remember them, and through remembering to consider what we owe to those who die in our nation's wars. What obligation their sacrifice creates, what responsibility we bear to ensure that their deaths were not wasted, that the lessons of their sacrifice are learned, that future wars are fought only when necessary, and are ended when they become unwinnable, that no more names need be added to walls that should not have to be built. Across Vietnamese countryside where the war was fought, where bombs fell like rain for years, where chemicals were sprayed to strip foliage and expose enemy hiding places, where villages were burned and fields were cratered and forests were destroyed. The land itself bears scars that have not healed. Bomb craters dot the landscape, filled with water-forming ponds where fish swim and children play, making beauty from destruction, but also making permanent the holes torn in earth by explosives dropped from heights where the ground was abstract grid on map rather than place where people lived. The defoliated zones remain partially barren. Agent Orange killed not just leaves but roots, poisoned soil in ways that persist decades later, made the vigorous jungle that swallowed French outposts and hid Viet Cong tunnels into scraggly regrowth that will take centuries to fully recover, if it ever does. The unexploded ordnance that litters the countryside is perhaps the war's most insidious legacy. The bombs and shells that failed to detonate when dropped or fired did not disappear but remained buried, waiting, ticking slowly toward eventual explosion or waiting for farmers' plow to strike them, for child playing to disturb them, for erosion to expose them, for any of the countless ways that dormant explosives can become active killers decades after the war that deployed them ended. The estimate is that 10 to 15% of ordnance failed to explode on impact. 10 to 15% of the millions of tons of explosives dropped on Vietnam during the war, creating millions of potential casualties waiting to happen, creating the situation where farming is dangerous, where children cannot play freely in fields, where the war continues killing long after the fighting stopped. Over 40,000 Vietnamese have been killed by unexploded ordnance since the war ended, more than 1,000 per year on average, the deaths continuing steadily as the dormant weapons are encountered, as poverty drives farmers to sell scrap metal they find, including live ordnance they cannot identify, as land development in former combat zones uncovers weapons that have been buried for decades, as monsoon rains wash away soil and expose what was hidden. The clearance efforts are ongoing. International organizations and Vietnamese military work to locate and destroy the ordnance, using metal detectors and trained dogs, and sometimes simply careful prodding with sticks, working inch by inch through former battlefields, removing and detonating the ordnance safely when possible, accepting that complete clearance will take decades more, that some percentage will never be found, that some Vietnamese will die from the war long after everyone who fought it has died of natural causes. Agent Orange was sprayed to defoliate jungles and destroy crops, to deny Viet Cong the cover that made them so difficult to engage, to create free-fire zones where anything that moved could be targeted because the foliage that would have hidden civilians had been removed. The logic was military, the tactical advantage of exposing the enemy, but the human cost was immense and continues to compound. The herbicide was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known, that causes cancer and birth defects and diabetes and other diseases, that persists in environment for decades, that enters food chain through contaminated soil and water, that affects people who were never directly sprayed but who ate fish from contaminated rivers or vegetables grown in contaminated soil. That passes from generation to generation as genetic damage affects children and grandchildren of those exposed. The Vietnamese children born with birth defects linked to Agent Orange number in the hundreds of thousands: spina bifida, cleft palate, extra digits, missing digits, severe physical and intellectual disabilities, conditions that Vietnamese doctors recognize immediately as products of dioxin exposure, that affect families that had no connection to war except living in regions where Agent Orange was sprayed. That creates suffering that will continue for generations because the contamination persists, because the dioxin breaks down slowly, because the cleanup of hotspots is expensive and incomplete, because the full extent of genetic damage may not be known for decades more as effects appear in generations not yet born. The American veterans exposed to Agent Orange developed similar conditions: cancers and diabetes and peripheral neuropathy, birth defects in their children, health problems that appeared years or decades after exposure, that were initially denied by Department of Veterans Affairs, that required lawsuits and advocacy and eventual recognition that the herbicide was responsible, that led to compensation for veterans and their families, that created precedent for acknowledging long-term health effects of military service, that demonstrated that wars inflict casualties long after combat ends, that the wounded include those who carry poison in their bodies, who transmit that poison to their children, who suffer and die from exposure to weapons their own government deployed without adequate testing or without caring about long-term consequences. The reconciliation efforts between Vietnam and America have been genuine but incomplete. The two countries established diplomatic relations in 1995, 20 years after the war ended, began economic cooperation that has made Vietnam into manufacturing center and trading partner, created relationship, where the war is past rather than present, where pragmatic interests overcome historical grievances. The joint efforts to locate remains of American MIA missing in action have recovered and identified remains that bring closure to families, that enable proper burial, that represent American concern for accounting for every soldier, commitment that Vietnam has honored despite their own vastly larger number of missing. Despite the asymmetry where American missing are searched for intensively, while Vietnamese missing are often forgotten or remain in mass graves, or were never documented because record-keeping during the war was inconsistent. The American funding for prosthetics and landmine removal and dioxin cleanup represents acknowledgement of responsibility without admission of legal liability, represents humanitarian assistance that addresses the war's continuing consequences without requiring litigation or compensation, represents practical approach to healing wounds while avoiding the legal and political complications that full acknowledgement would create. The Vietnamese acceptance of this assistance without demanding full compensation or apology represents pragmatic decision to move forward, to build relationship with former enemy that is now important trade partner and potential security partner against China, to let past wounds heal rather than insisting they be fully redressed, to recognize that dwelling on grievances serves no purpose when the alternative is economic development and normal relations that benefit both countries. But the fields remember. The silence where villages stood speaks of what was lost when the war destroyed not just buildings but communities, not just individual lives but the social fabric that held villages together, that connected people to land and to ancestors buried in that land, that gave meaning to existence beyond survival. The bomb craters and defoliated zones and unexploded ordnance testify to violence that modern warfare inflicts not just on soldiers, but on landscape itself, on ecology and environment, on the earth that will carry the war's marks long after human memory fades, that will pass those marks to future generations who had no part in the conflict, but inherit its consequences. We close standing in rice paddy where green shoots grow again, where farmers work land that their ancestors worked before the war came, where water buffalo pull plows and women plant rice seedlings in patterns that have not changed in centuries, where life continues despite the buried bombs and chemical residue, where resilience of human spirit and Earth's capacity for renewal offer hope that even the deepest wounds can heal, that even the most poisoned land can eventually grow food again, that even the most scarred people can eventually find peace, that the silence of the fields is not only silence of loss, but also silence of healing, of time passing, of generations succeeding generations, of the dead being mourned and buried and remembered while the living continue, as they must, as they always have, tending the land and raising children and building future that the war tried to destroy but could not prevent, that emerges from the ruins not by forgetting but by choosing to move forward. To let healing happen while acknowledging that some scars remain, that the fields where silence speaks carry both memory and hope, that the past cannot be changed but the future can be built, that the war ended but life continues, that Vietnam survived and rebuilt and became nation again, whole if not healed, united if not entirely reconciled, moving forward into future that the war almost foreclosed, but that the Vietnamese people preserved through endurance and sacrifice, that exceeded what any nation should have been required to bear, but that they bore anyway and survived and prevailed, not through defeating America militarily, but through outlasting America politically, through accepting casualties that America could not accept, through understanding that time was on their side, that the fields would still be there after the Americans left, that the silence that followed the bombs would eventually be filled not with explosions, but with the sounds of ordinary life, children playing, farmers planting, families gathering, the sounds of a nation that survived and remembers and speaks through the silence of its fields, where the war was fought, and where peace was born from the earth that absorbed the blood and the chemicals and the explosives and somehow, impossibly, made life possible again. In Pentagon halls where future conflicts are planned, in policy seminars where previous wars are analyzed, in veterans' memoirs that attempt to explain what happened and why, in academic histories that seek patterns and lessons. The search continues for understanding of what Vietnam teaches, of what went wrong and whether different approach could have succeeded, of whether the war was unwinnable from the start or was lost through failures of strategy and will, of whether the domino theory that justified the intervention was valid or was Cold War paranoia, of whether the cost in lives and treasure was justified by the objectives, or was tragic waste of resources and lives for goals that were not achieved and perhaps were not achievable. The lessons that different observers draw from Vietnam depend on premises they bring to the analysis, on what they believe about the nature of the conflict, about the legitimacy of American intervention, about the possibilities that existed and the choices that were made. For those who believed the war was necessary containment of communist expansion, the lesson is that America failed to commit sufficient resources or failed to fight effectively, or was undermined by domestic opposition that emboldened the enemy and made victory impossible, the lesson being that wars must be fought with overwhelming force and with unified domestic support, that gradualism and half measures lead to defeat, that political constraints that prevent military from using full power guarantee failure. The conclusion for these observers is not that Vietnam should not have been fought, but that it should have been fought differently, with invasion of North Vietnam, and with bombing unrestricted by political concerns about Chinese or Soviet intervention, with acceptance that winning might require nuclear weapons, with willingness to accept American casualties in hundreds of thousands if that was price of victory. For those who believed the war was unjustified intervention in civil conflict, the lesson is that America should not fight wars against nationalist movements that have popular support, that military power cannot create political legitimacy, that supporting corrupt authoritarian regimes in name of anti-communism undermines American values and creates situations where victory means incompatible with democratic principles. That the domino theory was false as evidenced by fact that when Vietnam fell to communism, the predicted cascade did not occur. Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia did not fall. The containment policy's assumption that communism was monolithic force that would spread unless stopped everywhere was wrong. Vietnam's communism was primarily nationalist. China and Vietnam fought border war in 1979, proving that communist solidarity was weaker than national interests. The Vietnam Syndrome that shaped American military policy for decades reflected the lesson that wars of choice should be avoided, that ground wars in Asia should not be fought, that commitment of American forces requires clear objectives and overwhelming force, an exit strategy and broad domestic support, that incremental escalation without defined endpoint creates quagmire from which extraction becomes impossible without admitting defeat. The Powell Doctrine that codified these lessons insisted on using decisive force when force was used, on having political objective clearly defined, on ensuring domestic support before committing forces, on avoiding gradual escalation that allows enemy to adapt, and that bleeds American will through sustained casualties without decisive outcome. The doctrine represented institutional memory of Vietnam, reflected determination not to repeat mistakes, insisted on conditions that would prevent another protracted conflict without defined goals or achievable victory conditions. But the lessons seem to require relearning. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan echoed Vietnam's patterns in troubling ways. Initial confidence gave way to grinding stalemate. Nation-building proved harder than defeating armies. Nationalist resistance was underestimated. Technological advantage could not compensate for lack of political legitimacy. Enemy that was defeated militarily regenerated politically. Difficulty of distinguishing friend from enemy in counterinsurgency created situation where civilian casualties alienated population. Metrics of progress measured activity rather than actual advance toward definable goal. Political pressure to show results led to optimistic reports that contradicted reality on ground. Withdrawal eventually occurred not because objectives were achieved, but because cost of continuing exceeded political will to persist. The fundamental question Vietnam poses is what military power can achieve, and what are its limits? The war demonstrated that even the world's most powerful military cannot defeat determined resistance fighting on home ground. That superior firepower cannot compensate for lack of political legitimacy. That wars fought for abstract strategic concepts rather than vital interests struggle to maintain public support when costs mount. That allies who depend entirely on foreign support will collapse when that support is withdrawn. That technology creates advantages in battle, but cannot win wars when wars are ultimately political rather than military contests. When the question is not who can kill more efficiently, but who can endure longer and mobilize population more effectively, and maintain legitimacy more successfully. Yet the lesson seems to be forgotten between crises, seems to require relearning through experience rather than being absorbed through historical study. Each new conflict begins with confidence that this time will be different, that we have learned from past mistakes, that the strategy is sound and the goals are achievable, and the commitment is sustainable, that this time the military power will translate into political success, that this time the technology will be decisive, that this time the enemy will not have the determination that previous enemies had, that this time the domestic support will not fracture under sustained casualties and inconclusive results. And each time, some or all of these assumptions prove false, some or all of the confidence proves misplaced, some or all of the optimistic predictions prove wrong, and the question arises again whether the lesson has been learned, or whether institutional memory is too short, whether each generation must discover through bitter experience what the previous generation learned and tried to teach, but could not make stick, could not embed deeply enough to prevent repetition. The personal lessons of those who fought are different from the institutional lessons, are harder to reduce to doctrine or policy. The veterans who emerged from Vietnam carried knowledge that official narratives were unreliable, that what politicians promise and what actually happens in war bear little resemblance, that soldiers fight for each other rather than for abstract causes, that courage and cowardice coexist, that line between legitimate combat and atrocity is thinner than training suggests, that war reveals human capacity for both heroism and brutality, that those who survive carry burdens that civilians cannot fully comprehend, that reintegration into society that did not experience what veterans experienced creates isolation, that the war never fully ends for those who fought it even when official hostilities cease, that the question of whether the deaths were meaningful can never be fully answered because meaning is not inherent in death, but is created by how survivors understand and respond to those deaths. The lesson that the war could have been avoided, that the initial decision to intervene was error, that subsequent escalations were attempts to avoid admitting error, that sunk costs created pressure to continue rather than being reason to continue, that withdrawal that should have occurred in 1965 or 1968 or 1969 was delayed until 1973 by presidents who feared being first to lose a war, who valued their political reputations more than lives of soldiers who continued dying for a cause that was already lost. This lesson seems too terrible to fully acknowledge, seems to require admitting that American political system failed catastrophically, that checks and balances did not prevent disaster, that democratic processes did not force accountability until after the damage was done, that the deaths were not just tragic but were avoidable, that 58,000 Americans and 3 million Vietnamese died for reasons that were inadequate, that the war was not worth fighting and certainly was not worth continuing once it became clear that victory was not achievable at acceptable cost. We close with the recognition that Vietnam's lessons are both clear and contested, that different observers draw different conclusions, that consensus about what the war teaches remains elusive 50 years after its end. The Hawks believe the war could have been won with different strategy. The Doves believe the war should not have been fought. The veterans believe the war should be remembered for their service, regardless of the war's purposes. The Vietnamese believe the war was necessary resistance to foreign aggression, regardless of the system that emerged afterward. The lessons multiply rather than converging, suggest that perhaps the search for lessons is itself misguided, that wars are too complex and too contingent to yield clear guidance, that each conflict is unique enough that previous experience provides only limited instruction, that the human tendency to fight wars will continue regardless of lessons, because the decision to go to war is driven by current fears and ambitions rather than by historical precedents, by the conviction that this time is different rather than by recognition that some patterns repeat regardless of technology or tactics, that the lesson that remains unlearned may be unlearnable because learning it requires acknowledging limits of national power and wisdom, requires accepting that some problems cannot be solved through military force, requires admitting that wars begun with confidence can end in disaster, requires humility that great powers rarely possess, requires restraint that domestic politics rarely rewards, requires the courage to not fight rather than the courage to fight, requires understanding that the hardest lesson of Vietnam is not how to fight wars better, but how to avoid fighting wars that should not be fought, how to distinguish between conflicts that are necessary and conflicts that are merely possible, how to calculate costs honestly before committing rather than discovering costs through experience, how to end wars that are failing before the casualties mount to levels that make the war impossible to justify, but also impossible to abandon without admitting error. How to learn from Vietnam not just tactical lessons about counterinsurgency, but strategic lessons about the limits of what military power can achieve, about the costs of credibility pursued beyond reason, about the dangers of incrementalism without defined endpoint, about the necessity of honest assessment even when honesty requires acknowledging failure, about the lesson that remains unlearned because learning it requires remembering not just what we want to remember, but also what we want to forget, requires confronting not just the heroism and sacrifice, but also the errors and waste and the deaths that achieved nothing, requires acknowledging that Vietnam's lesson is less about how to win wars than about how to avoid them, less about strategy than about wisdom, less about power than about limits, less about what we can do than about what we should do. The lesson that remains unlearned because learning it is painful, because it requires admitting that great powers can make catastrophic mistakes, that wars can be lost, that intentions do not matter if outcomes are disastrous, that the lesson is available but must be chosen, must be remembered and applied rather than simply studied and filed away until the next crisis when confidence rises again, and the cycle repeats, and the question returns whether this time, finally, the lesson has been learned or whether once again we will discover through experience what history could have taught us if only we had been willing to listen, to learn, to remember, to apply the lesson that Vietnam offers, the lesson that remains unlearned. That some wars should not be fought, that some causes are not worth the cost, that wisdom sometimes requires restraint rather than action, that the hardest courage is the courage to not fight, that the greatest strength is the strength to admit error and change course, that the most important lesson is knowing which lessons matter, and having the wisdom and humility to apply them before the casualties accumulate, and the costs become unbearable, and the lesson is learned again through suffering that could have been avoided if only the previous lesson had been remembered, if only the unlearned lesson had been learned. Closing. The war that continues teaching the Vietnam War ended in 1975, but continues teaching. Continues asking questions that each generation must answer. When should nations go to war? What can military power achieve? What are the limits of force? How do we honor those who serve without glorifying the wars they fight? How do we remember the dead without valorizing their deaths? How do we learn from mistakes without dishonoring those who made sacrifices that the mistakes required? The war divided the world, but particularly divided America, created rifts that persist in how we remember the war, in what lessons we draw from it, in whether we view it as noble cause betrayed or tragic error compounded. The divisions mean that consensus about Vietnam remains impossible, that the search for lessons continues, that each new conflict revives the debates, that the war's legacy is not settled history, but ongoing argument about American power and purpose. We have walked through jungles where monsoons fell, through tunnels where darkness swallowed light, through cities where Tet shattered illusions, through campuses where spring turned red, through trails that never closed, through rooms where peace was poisoned, through helicopters that left people behind, through walls where names become memory, through fields where silence speaks. We have witnessed war that killed millions and changed nations and taught lessons that remain contested. As sleep approaches, we carry these lessons forward, carry the weight of what was lost and what was learned, carry the recognition that wars are easier to start than to end, that commitments are easier to make than to keep, that confidence is easier to maintain than to justify, that the costs are always higher than predicted, that the outcomes are rarely what was promised, that the lessons are available but must be chosen. The war that divided the world, the conflict that continues teaching, the lesson that remains unlearned, forever asking whether we will remember, forever warning of what happens when we forget, forever the teacher that speaks through silence, through names on walls, through scars on land, through memories of those who fought and those who died and those who survived and those who were never the same. Sleep now. The war is over, but its questions persist. The teaching continues. The lesson waits forever.